Welcome. We're here today with Dr. Steve Prince at the University of South Florida, and we're going to talk about an article that he published a few years ago in the Journal of Southern History about the Robert Charles riot in New Orleans in 1900, and also a little bit probably about his forthcoming book on the same topic. So, Steve, if you could just start out and maybe give us just a quick overview of what happens in 1900 with Robert Charles in New Orleans.
Sure, yeah. Just a little backstory. 1900 is really sort of at the center of the birth of the Jim Crow system. Rayford Logan, a historian, referred to this general period as the nadir of Southern history for African Americans, the sort of darkest moment, the most violent moment. And if you wanted to pick a nadir of the nadir, 1900 would be a pretty okay selection. So this is the peak of lynching across the South, a series of race riots, including the New Orleans riot, are occurring throughout this time period. African Americans are losing the right to vote across the South in violation of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So this is the world in which Southern African Americans find themselves. In addition to that, you have the rise of segregation ordinances all across the South. So the public spaces of the South are being segregated into these spaces are for white people, and these inferior spaces are for African Americans. So that's the larger sort of regional context. What happens in July 1900 is a man named Robert Charles. He's a 35-year-old African-American man, born in Mississippi, had been in New Orleans for 5 or 6 years at that point, working a variety of jobs. Robert Charles is sitting with his friend Leonard Pierce on a stoop. 3 white police officers walk over to them. Words are exchanged. We don't know exactly what was said. But one of the white police officers takes out his billy club and begins to attack Robert Charles. Charles stands up. He draws a weapon, a pistol that he has. The police officers draw their own weapons. Shots are exchanged. One of the officers was wounded, and Charles was wounded as well. He escapes into the night. Later that night, the New Orleans Police Department locates Charles at his apartment, and they go to arrest him. But Charles is waiting for them, and he has a Winchester rifle, and he shoots and kills 2 white police officers before escaping again. And Robert Charles is in hiding for about 3 days. The police can't find him. The white residents of the city cannot find him. During that time, the white residents of New Orleans, ostensibly while searching for Robert Charles, but really just in a sort of a spasm of white supremacist rage and anger, they take to the streets. White mobs target and beat dozens of African Americans. Over the course of several days, they kill 4 or 5, eventually 6 African Americans, none of whom had anything to do with Robert Charles, all of whom found themselves effectively in the wrong place at the wrong time. Finally, at the end of this week of violence, the white authorities locate Robert Charles, where he's been hiding in a sort of friend's apartment for several days. He shoots and kills 2 more white police officers, at which point a crowd gathers. It's estimated that there were thousands of people surrounding Robert Charles's hideout. There's a sort of climactic shootout where he is on the 2nd floor of this building, armed with his Winchester rifle, firing at the crowd below, who of course is firing back at him. Thousands of rounds fired at this sort of hideout where Charles is making his last stands. Finally, the building is set on fire, and Charles is killed as he exits the building. The crowd sort of sets upon the corpse and beats it, shoots it something like 30 more times before the police finally sort of take the body away. Charles is eventually buried in an unmarked grave. And that's the sort of the end of this week of violence.
Mm-hmm. How does this fit in with the sort of establishment of segregation and Jim Crow more broadly within Louisiana? So it's a few years after the 1896 election. So I'm just wondering if you can say a bit about sort of the political background, because in some ways this confrontation between white police and African American citizen could have happened at any time during, from 1865 until last week, effectively.
Yeah.
So how does this situate itself within what's going on politically in terms of the establishment of Jim Crow?
Good. Yeah. So the sort of, again, in a larger sense, I think it's really important to point out that I think a lot of students of history, a lot of people who aren't that familiar with Southern history, sort of assume that Jim Crow was born immediately after Reconstruction. So you have this period of Reconstruction after the Civil War, the expansion of African American rights, the expansion of citizenship to African Americans, voting rights for Black men in the South, African American office holding across the South. And I think the assumption is that the sort of overthrow of Reconstruction immediately leads, the next day to the denial of Black voting rights and the segregation of public space. And actually, that's not true. And it's important to realize that, the sort of generally accepted overthrow of Reconstruction is 1877. It's not really until the late 1880s or into the 1890s that the sort of birth of Jim Crow begins in earnest. And that's important because we need to realize that this is a conscious project of domination on the part of the elite white ruling class in the South. It doesn't just happen. It's a very conscious attempt to reaffirm and reestablish white supremacy in the latter part of the 19th century. So the disfranchisement constitutions and legislations, the means by which the Southern states deny African American men the right to vote, really begins in earnest in Mississippi in 1890. Louisiana's disfranchising constitution was 1898. So that's, just a couple of years before Robert Charles's confrontation with the police in New Orleans. It's worth pointing out that Charles was born in around 1865. So he was born in the Reconstruction moment. He was raised in sort of this moment of political possibility. He was still in Mississippi in 1890 when the state of Mississippi denied African American men the right to vote. He moved to New Orleans around 1895, 1896, and was in Louisiana when Louisiana denied African American men the right to vote. So it's entirely possible, we don't know this for certain, that Robert Charles was denied the right to vote 2 separate times in 2 separate states. And that context, certainly has an effect. In New Orleans, 1896 brings a reform mayor to power. In 1900, in the immediate the immediate sort of the months preceding Robert Charles's confrontation with the police officers, we see the restoration of the so-called ring, the sort of the Bourbon Democrats to power in New Orleans. So that local context does matter, but I think for me it's the sort of the broader regional context that is the more important way to think about this. So 1898, that is when Louisiana holds its state constitution, holds a constitutional convention to rewrite its state constitution. It's against the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution to simply say Black people cannot vote. That would violate the 15th Amendment. So the Southern states established a variety of sort of almost ingenious ways to deny African American men the right to vote without saying what they're doing. Louisiana's sort of contribution to this larger political project is the Grandfather Clause, which is a way of allowing poor white men to vote, but not allowing poor Black men to vote. So basically, the Louisiana Constitution inserts a literacy test in the Constitution. You have to prove that you can read. But this Grandfather Clause says you don't have to prove that you can read if your grandfather was a registered voter in the state of Louisiana. I believe the year is 1860. And as you can imagine, the electorate in Louisiana in 1860 was entirely white. Black men were not allowed to vote in Louisiana in 1860. So this is a way of allowing illiterate and impoverished white men to vote, but keeping Black men from being able to exercise the right to vote. So again, that's just 2 years before the Robert Charles confrontation with the police officer. 1902 is when in terms of segregation, the segregation of public space, the railways in Louisiana had been segregated starting in the late 1880s. In the early 1890s, a committee of citizens in New Orleans organizes a test case to test the constitutionality of these provisions segregating the railways in Louisiana by race. That case made it to the Supreme Court in 1896, and in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, the United States Supreme Court ruled effectively that segregation by race was constitutional, provided that the accommodations provided to the races were separate but equal, so that African Americans were provided with equal accommodations to whites, even if they were separate. It's important to note that that case is born in New Orleans, not just in Louisiana. That is a New Orleans case that makes it to the United States Supreme Court. Again, that's 1896. 1898 is the Disfranchisement Convention. Fast forward a little bit, 1902 is when the streetcars of New Orleans, the famed green and red streetcars that still move around the city today, those streetcars were finally segregated by race in 1902. So you can see all of these sort of, large scale political events are really bookending this moment of violence. So, on the one hand, you're absolutely correct that it could have occurred at any moment, but I think that the sort of, political context is really important, and these issues of race and access and citizenship and particularly debates over public space, I think are really essential to understanding what Robert Charles might have been thinking and why the white residents of New Orleans were so quick to resort to widespread, effectively a massacre in response to Charles's killing of those two white police officers.
And also thinking about public space, this is a time period when the city itself is starting to expand its footprint. And I know not so much in the article, but in the forthcoming book, you go into a good bit more detail about the circle of acquaintances that Charles had and the people that he hid out with and so forth. Can you explain a little bit about this sort of expansion of new neighborhoods in back of the city or the back of town area, and sort of how just what the living conditions were like there as opposed to the more established parts of the city?
Yeah. So, as your students may or may not know, depending on their familiarity with the city, New Orleans is surrounded on three sides effectively by the Mississippi River. And the early settlement of the city occurred in within very close proximity to the river. That is actually the highest land in the city. That's the area that was settled first, starting with the French Quarter and then sort of expanding down along the river. The area is sort of what in New Orleans they would call back of the river. The areas alongside the river were known as the front of town, and the areas sort of further from the river, closer to Lake Pontchartrain, were known as the back of town. And for much of the early history of New Orleans, that was quite literally a swamp. It was largely uninhabited. Enslaved people would escape there. Maroon settlements sort of sprang up in back of town New Orleans. It was quite literally a swamp, and the sort of landmass of the city today, the vast majority of that was uninhabited and effectively uninhabitable. Starting in the late 19th century and then proceeding in the early 20th century, a series of public work projects start to sort of drain that back swamp. And as a result, the lived inhabited area of the city starts to sort of encroach further and further into the swamps. But still you have a very sort of raced and classed residential pattern. Whereas during the era of slavery, a sort of limited pattern of integration was sort of the norm. Enslaved people tended to actually live relatively close to their owners. As sort of in the era of freedom, as the sort of possibility of living further and further into this swamp expands, you see that the African Americans, immigrants, the lower class sort of generally is sort of forced into these peripheral areas, these blocks that are quite literally being sort of hacked from the swamps in the back of the city. sort of, one block at a time. And you can actually, if you look at the maps of the era, you can actually see that the city is quite literally growing. What had previously been a thin band of settlements, just a handful of blocks along the river, increasingly is moving further and further into what will be called the back of town. And that is the area of the city that is Robert Charles's home. He is a working class African American from Mississippi. Those are the cheapest areas of town. St. Charles Avenue and the French Quarter, the sort of iconic tourist areas of the city of New Orleans to this day. Those are largely inhabited by whites. They're largely inhabited by the well-to-do people of the city. People like Robert Charles are living in shacks and sort of small shotgun cottages in these newest parts of the city that come to be known as the back of town. The city government doesn't try very hard to provide these residents with services. They're not, frankly, that important. They're the working class, they're African Americans. So things like electric lighting and sidewalks and proper drainage come much later to back of town areas of New Orleans than they do to the sort of, again, to St. Charles Avenue and the wider, more well-to-do parts of the city. So the story of Robert Charles is really the story of back of town New Orleanians, people like Charles who have come to the city only recently. They make their home in these sort of transitional blocks, these transitional neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods, largely ignored by the city. And I argue in the book, actually sort of consciously ignored. It's much easier for the sort of powers that be in the city to just block out those residents, that part of town. Their labor is all important. So these are people who are, working and, they are digging the ditches. They are laying the streetcar tracks. They are in some cases working on the levees and the shipping industry. So these African-American laborers are the all-important sort of workforce that allows the city to function. But at the same time, there's a sort of a cognitive dissonance, a sort of conscious attempt to just ignore the back of town and its residents in the interests of sort of white supremacy and elite rule in the city. So there's this really interesting interplay between a white power structure that desperately needs the labor that people like Robert Charles and other back of town residents provide, but also the white powers that be, the city government doesn't want much of anything to do with those people and does everything they can to ignore those parts of town that don't easily fit with the sort of myth that white New Orleans builds for itself around the turn of the century.
And speaking of myth, that sort of segues nicely into the second aspect of the article, which is not just the events of the confrontation with Robert Charles and what follows after that in 1900, but the subsequent memory of that. And I'll say that we're all familiar, not everybody, but a lot of people who are somewhat familiar with this will be familiar with the interview with Jelly Roll Morton that Alan Lomax did in 1938, I think, or the mid-1930s, where Morton, who was around back then, sort of says, yes, and in fact, there was even a song about it, but I've forgotten the words because it's safer to not know about that and so forth. But one of the things that you do in this article is actually dig out a number of cases where African Americans did make reference in public to Robert Charles. And I was wondering a couple of things about that. First, if you could just give us a overview of what you take from that, and how does this make us slightly re-understand life under Jim Crow in New Orleans and in the South more broadly. But before you get into that, can you say a bit about your research process for that? How did you find these episodes like this?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, the interview with Morton was the sort of opening for me, as I think it is for a lot of people. And it's a really fascinating passage where he says, he talks at great length about Robert Charles and then says, there used to be a song, but I found it was best for me to forget that song in order to make my way in the world and to get along with folks. I forgot that song. The police squashed it and I forgot it. And it's this very interesting opening because on the one hand, he says, I forgot it. I don't remember it. But on the other hand, he's just talked at significant length about Robert Charles and about the riot with some level of detail, some 38 years later. So he didn't forget anything. He's if you read between the lines, you know that he's choosing not to share it. But most scholars who have dealt with Robert Charles or with the question of memory haven't gone much beyond Morton. They sometimes simply factually say a song about Robert Charles circulated in the black bars and clubs of New Orleans before it was forgotten. They sort of just take Morton at his word, and don't, interrogate that any further. So that was my opening. I wanted to sort of see, was there a song? Spoiler, I have been unable to find the song. Everybody always asks that. I have been unable to find it. Musicologists have spent years looking for this song. There may have been a song. It's almost certain that people sang some verses perhaps about Robert Charles as part of, other songs, but in terms of sort of formal sheet music or anything like that, it hasn't been found. But that's not really my interest. I think Jelly Roll Morton provides a really interesting opening into this larger conversation about remembrance and forgetting specifically. So in terms of the research process, which I think was the first question, it sort of proceeded along two tracks in the article, maybe three tracks. One was sort of the way that white New Orleanians remembered, or more accurately, forgot Robert Charles. And I very quickly decided that there's a fairly conscious attempt to forget Robert Charles and this event. So there's a moment in the immediate aftermath of the riot where white New Orleanians seem as if they are going to commemorate this event and memorialize it. They establish a fund for the families of Robert Charles's, the police officers that Robert Charles kills. Mayor Paul Capdeville had deputized a citizen police force, sort of volunteer citizen police, who roams the streets in an attempt to put down the rioters during the worst of the white violence, the mob action. And Capdeville mints these sort of commemorative badges for all of the men who were involved as citizen police. So there's a moment where it really appears like the white residents of New Orleans are going to treat this as an important and commemoration-worthy sort of moment in the history of the city. But that slides off very, very quickly. One of the white editors of one of the city newspapers actually says quite explicitly in his newspaper, "I am not going to write any more about Robert Charles." He says that the more that we write about Robert Charles, the more likely it is that he will be turned into some, he says basically a black Richard the Lionhearted, I think is what he says. He says it in French, but or we'll get some sort of copycat who will try to emulate Robert Charles. And he quite explicitly says, we're going to stop talking about this event. It's safer that way. So that's happening on the one hand. And then if you sort of expand, the city, the white residents of New Orleans really don't talk about Robert Charles and the 1900 riot very much. And, if you take it into the 20th century, this is more in the book than in the article, white New Orleanians are happy to remember a variety of other things about the city that are unsavory and problematic. And popular histories of New Orleans have no problem talking about yellow fever epidemics and the 1891 lynching of 11 Italians in the city after the killing of a police chief. And they all talk about Storyville, the notorious red light and the vice district of the city. So all of these popular histories of the city that come out in the 20th century are very happy to talk about all sorts of things that aren't very nice, frankly. But not Robert Charles, not the 1900 riot. It simply doesn't appear in sort of white histories of the city. So counterpose that to African Americans, where it does appear. Particularly, I found, I was lucky enough to, the article that I wrote probably wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the memoirs of early jazzmen like Jelly Roll Morton. It just so happens that most of those first generation of New Orleans jazzmen, jazz is born in New Orleans in the very early 20th century, right, in the years immediately following the Robert Charles riot. So, musicologists, jazz enthusiasts hurried in the mid 20th century to do interviews with that first generation of musicians. So we have a sizable body of sort of, it's really remarkable sort of body of scholarship that provides. These are largely African Americans, not entirely, but these are a perspective that wouldn't necessarily be preserved, other than the fact that the history of jazz happened to the birthplace of jazz and is right at this moment. So nobody was recording these interviews or publishing these memoirs of the first generation of jazz musicians because they were interested in Robert Charles, right? That's the furthest thing from Alan Lomax's mind. But as a result of this, you have, something like 8, 9, 10, maybe 12 of these sort of early, oral histories. The Hogan Jazz Archive at Tulane University contains, dozens of these really valuable oral histories. But these people do remember Robert Charles, and they do talk about Robert Charles at some length. So it's not just Jelly Roll Morton. There's actually a sort of, sizable alternative archive of commemoration, African Americans who do remember Robert Charles, and talk about him and the riot in very interesting and productive sorts of ways. So you have this interesting counterpoint of sort of white silence and forgetting and Black commemoration. And that's, a sort of a really interesting thing that I wanted to explore a little bit. So I think that's where the research started. But then quite frankly, using newspaper databases. I think the article probably would not have been possible without, keyword searchable newspapers for that early 20th century time period. I found out that between, say 1900 and 1915 or so, dozens of African Americans do mention Robert Charles in public many times in the midst of confrontations with the police in and around New Orleans. And that's a remarkable statement. So, Jelly Roll Morton would have us believe that the commemoration of Robert Charles occurs only in secret, it's Black music clubs and Black houses where people are commemorating and telling the story and playing the song. But actually, it turns out they were doing it in public too, and they were doing it in the midst of confrontations with white authorities. They will mention Robert Charles, say things like, I will be a second Robert Charles, or Robert Charles was the hero of the century, which is shocking when you find it, because it was extraordinarily risky as an African-American man in New Orleans just after the turn of the 20th century to say Robert Charles, who killed 7 white people, was the hero of the century. I mean, that is a bold statement. At best, you get arrested. At worst, you get beaten or killed for saying such things in public within the hearing of the New Orleans Police Department, white officers in the early 20th century. And the fact that it wasn't just once, it was dozens of times that, Robert Charles is made reference to. And, that's not occurring sui generis. It's not as if each of those individuals is the only person who remembers Robert Charles. When you start to see this evocation of Charles multiple times, clearly there's something else going on there. There is a sort of deeper shared commemorative practice that is undergirding those sort of specific moments of memorialization and commemoration. So that's what I tried to sort of unpack in the article, the sort of, long-term patterns of commemoration, and to go beyond simply saying African Americans in and around New Orleans remembered Robert Charles, full stop. That's, people have said that, but I really wanted to unpack how and when and why and the uses to which the memory of Robert Charles was put, and the ways that it functioned as a form of resistance to the Jim Crow regime.
I think it's interesting too that it gives us a slightly different perspective, certainly a more complex perspective of the role of violence within Jim Crow and memory and depiction of violence within Jim Crow. So one of the things that you emphasize in the article and sort of expand on in the book is that, especially finding these incidents that you just talked about from 1900 to 1915, it's a much more sort of public celebration of, defiance of violent white supremacy, and sort of celebrating violent retaliation against white supremacy, which is not always the story that we've usually thought of when we go back and think of Rayford Logan and the Nadir and so forth. It reminds me a bit of Adam Gussow's book
Mhm.
about violence and the blues, and especially that first chapter on Bessie Smith and Crazy Blues, where she talks about, something about, I'm going to go crazy and kill some police or something like that. So that's an undercurrent of the culture and of the way African Americans are adapting themselves and sort of dealing with this onset of Jim Crow at that time, it seems.
You're absolutely right, and Gussow does mention Robert Charles. I think as part of that chapter, I think he sort of juxtaposes the Crazy Blues with the story of Charles, largely based on again Morton's recollections. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that the Charles story helps us to center violence at the absolute center of Jim Crow in all sorts of ways, actually. So, on the one hand, it forces us to recognize and reckon with the varieties of white on black violence that underlay the entire project of Jim Crow. So, white apologists for segregation, in 1900 and certainly after, would say that this is a sort of benevolent regime where everybody is in their place and it's for the good of black and white Southerners that everybody keeps their place. But, a focus on a story like Robert Charles and the 1900 riot sort of explodes that feel-good narrative about the Jim Crow system, especially it's those sort of ultra-violent years of the birth of Jim Crow from about 1890 to 1910. Or so. But as you point out, it really helps us to think critically about the role of armed African American self-defense to the rise of Jim Crow. When people focus on violence in this era, it is almost always white on black violence, and that's with good reason. I mean, these are years when hundreds of African Americans are being killed. For a variety of real or imagined crimes by large mobs with unspeakable acts of sadism and cruelty. It is an extraordinarily violent time, and the sort of scale of white on black violence makes it almost impossible to see anything else. But African Americans were not always certainly did not always accept that violence, and when they resisted. With surprising frequency, they resisted with recourse to arms. They resisted with violence. They resisted violence with violence. And once you actually start looking, there a variety of these instances do sort of appear. And the work of Carlos Hill is a really important example of this. A couple other scholars have talked about it, but it's if you look at the sort of literature of African-American armed self-defense, there's a great literature that looks at it during the Reconstruction period. So Carol Lemberton's work certainly stands out there. And then there are a number of books that look at African-American armed self-defense during the sort of civil rights struggle of the mid-20th century. So let's see, Lance Hill and Simon Wentz, and there are a few others that look at, armed self-defense in the 1950s, 1960s. But that sort of birth of Jim Crow period, people have had relatively little to say about African-American armed self-defense. And I think the Robert Charles story really helps to foreground the fact that African-Americans did not accept the violation of their civil and political rights lying down, and that in many cases, they turned to firearms and they violently resisted the violent imposition of white supremacy. So that's a significant point. But then, also that the frequency with which the story of Robert Charles appears again and again in popular memory suggests that, it's obviously a minority of African Americans who pull out guns and make sort of armed war on white police departments the way Robert Charles did. Like most African Americans during the Jim Crow era clearly did not follow Robert Charles in his actions. But a much broader base of Black folks in and around New Orleans did remember Robert Charles years after the event and did feel like his story was important to them, and did talk about it in private and sometimes in public, in confrontation with white authorities. And I think, that suggests that there's an understanding of the importance and the power of African American armed self-defense that goes much further than simply the people who actually resorted to guns in order to defend their civil and political rights. So this is, this sort of cultural resistance to the Jim Crow regime is really significant. And I think it helps us to sort of, see the continuities between, on the one hand, full-scale armed rebellion of the sort that Robert Charles practices, and then the sort of, softer cultural forms of resistance that go on within Black communities throughout the early 20th and into the 21st century. And that the power of the Robert Charles story, the story of a man who did make war against the white authorities, the fact that that lives on for so long and takes, so many different retellings and in so many valences and variants, I think really suggests that a lot of people, sympathized with, if they didn't follow Charles, they at least recognized what he was doing, and they at least recognized the validity of his perspective and his rebellion. So I think, the study of his memory is really important for the light that it sheds on larger patterns of commemoration and resistance to white supremacy and Jim Crow.
Excellent. And again, all of this is laid out in much more detail and nuance and so forth in your book, which is forthcoming. Is it this calendar year, or is it in the spring?
No, it should be February or March of 2021. It's called The Ballad of Robert Charles, Searching for the New Orleans Riot of 1900. It'll be out with University of North Carolina Press. Don't quote me on this, but early in the spring, February, March.
Well, obviously everything's a bit up in the air in 2020, but it's wonderful. The book is coming out, and we'll all look forward to seeing it. Thanks very much for joining us and telling us all of this really interesting stuff about sort of what was happening in New Orleans around 1900, around this really interesting episode. And
It's always fun to talk about it. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.